Despite widespread controversy, you can know with absolute certainty that an all-intelligent mind created the universe and all life on Earth.
I can know with reasonable certainty that there is a widespread controversy. Surely you can't be more certain about God than you are certain that there's a controversy about God, can you?
Part 1 brought evidence from astronomy, biology, chemistry, and mathematics. Now comes even more stunning, yet largely little-known proofs.
This video has over 600,000 views, so these proofs shouldn't be stunning or little known anymore. But let's see if I can help illuminate. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. We took a look at part 1 of David C. Pack's Many Absolute Proofs video, and when I asked if you wanted more, many took to the comments to say, sure?
This is part 2 of 5 covering proof that God exists. His existence need not be taken on faith. Many just do not realize that science conclusively proves the existence of God. Any true God would never leave his creation, mankind, in doubt about whether he exists.
I'm not sure what you mean by true God, but I agree. The incredible ambiguity on this point is pretty solid evidence that if there is a God, he doesn't particularly care if we believe in him.
We pick up where we left off with the concept of irreducible complexity. Recall that Charles Darwin himself wrote in The Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down.
And, as anyone who read the book knows, the next sentence Darwin wrote was, "But I can find no such case." This is an incredibly common Christian quote mine. Not the little-known proof that I was promised.
You will see that Darwin would today say his theory has failed, utterly. Its many breakdowns mean it cannot be true. He would say this. Sadly, he's not here to tell us to drop his theory, that it's false.
On what do you base this, David? Charles Darwin passed before the advent of genetics that has done nothing but strengthen over and over the case for common ancestry and provide mechanism for variation. I'm pretty sure Darwin would feel very vindicated, as all science is judged on its ability to predict future findings.
If only people would believe Charles Darwin's own rules governing his ideas. No one would believe evolution. Back from the grave, he would be the first to disown the theory of evolution.
Science doesn't venerate authorities. It cares only about data and predictive modeling. No one accepts things simply because Darwin said them, or would cease to accept them if Darwin said to. Acceptance based solely on authority is such a Christian idea that it's difficult for David to understand this.
We start with an example of molecular machines to better appreciate the complexity of cells.
Okay, David, I see you're going to do a long description of the intelligent design movement's go-to example of the bacterial flagellum, all the while avoiding the phrase bacterial flagellum. Perhaps that's because this example is so strongly associated with intelligent design's greatest failure, the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, where a Christian scientist demonstrated why this is a bad example in open court, and a Christian judge ruled it to be not scientifically backed enough to be included in the curriculum.
Remember the key notion of irreducible complexity, and that is that this whole machine is completely useless until all the parts are in place. Well, that turns out not to be true. And I'll give you an example. What I have right here is a mousetrap from which I've removed 2 of the 5 parts. I still have the base plate, the spring, and the hammer. Now, you can't catch any mice with this, so it's not a very good mousetrap. But it turns out that despite the missing parts, it makes a perfectly good, if somewhat inelegant, tie clip. And when we look at the favorite examples for irreducible complexity, and the bacterial flagellum is a perfect example, we find the molecular equivalent of my tie clip, which is we see parts of the machine missing 2, 3, 4, maybe even 20 parts, but still fulfilling a perfectly good purpose that could be favored by evolution. And that's why the irreducible complexity argument falls apart.
The 139-page opinion ruled that intelligent design is not science. The fact that a scientific theory cannot yet render an explanation on every point should not be used as a pretext to thrust an untestable alternative hypothesis grounded in religion into the science classroom or to misrepresent well-established scientific propositions.
If you haven't seen the Nova documentary on the trial, Judgment Day, Intelligent Design on Trial, I highly recommend it. Still waiting for that stunning evidence, or even something little known.
In Germany, a research team used new instruments to examine an enormous molecule, the yeast 26S proteasome. Though not the largest molecule in existence, this one contains over 2 million protons and neutrons and is the largest non-symmetrical molecule mapped to date. Recognize such an organism could never have evolved gradually. This is literally impossible.
Literally impossible is an affirmative claim. What exactly about the yeast 26X proteasome prevents it from gradual evolution? The unusually large number of protons and neutrons? Sure, 1 million atoms is reasonable to evolve, but 2 million is too many? Sounds arbitrary.
Now, another amazing quote about a single, truly incredible organism. It is necessarily long to illustrate the complexity of just one molecular machine.
We don't have time to gawk at impressive sounding statistics. Let's skip ahead to the conclusion.
All of these proteins must be present for the cilium to function. If the tubulins are absent, then there are no filaments to slide. If the dynein is missing, then the cilium remains rigid and motionless. If nexin or the other connecting proteins are missing, then the axoneme falls apart when the filaments slide. What we see in the cilium, then, is not just profound complexity, but also irreducible complexity on the molecular scale.
David and his proponents should really try to find some new examples. Cilia has a lot of similarities with the flagellum of the previous example. What does David mean when he says cilia have irreducible complexity? He means that no incremental evolutionary path has been proposed. But he's wrong about that. Science is proponing and learning more about the evolution of cilia every year. Like all these recent peer-reviewed papers, including the comprehensive How Did Cilium Evolve from 2008 or Evolution of Cilia from 2016. In short, the sensory function of cilia evolved first, and the ciliary axoneme evolved gradually, with ciliary motility, an important selection mechanism, as one of the driving forces. Intermediary steps and functions refute David's claim that the complexity is conceptually irreducible.
Organisms are all complicated, some wonderfully so.
I wonder which of God creatures that David thinks are not wonderfully complicated.
And yet they cannot be reduced, diminished, or simplified in complexity. They had to come into being exactly as they are, because they never could have arrived at their present condition gradually.
This is simply David insisting that they can't arrive gradually, and that we are to trust him on this. He presents no evidence of a barrier stopping accumulated changes. Meanwhile, even in recent human history, we've seen bananas, broccoli, and every breed of dog emerge through gradual changes in a short time. Look up Evolution of X, where X is any species or biological system that you're curious about. And someone has broken down the gradual steps that would have been involved. Some of this process is speculation, but it's all in the realm of reasonable and possible, and often backed with solid evidence. David's irreducible complexity standard demands that incremental steps cannot even be imagined, which we've shown is demonstrably false.
Explaining the origin of the specific sequencing of proteins and DNA lies at the heart of the current crisis in materialistic evolutionary thinking. Proteins must appear in exact sequences to cause specific chemical reactions or build specific structures within the cells. This action is called specificity. It is because of specificity that proteins cannot substitute for one another. They are as different in purpose as an axe, drill, hammer, or screwdriver.
That's not a great analogy, but let's go with it for now. I would agree that if one wants a specific result in advance, then the order in which one uses the axe, the drill, the hammer, and the screwdriver is important. But in evolution, it's not about first desiring a specific result. It's about using trial and error to find the result that works. Obviously, there are many combinations of axe, drill, hammer, and screwdriver actions that create useless things. But one can also, equally obviously, stumble upon improvements to the sequence. What we have in DNA is the preservation of the most effective sequence that trial and error has stumbled upon so far. An accumulation of successes. That's not design.
Now, another source. Atheist Richard Dawkins has admitted the more statistically improbable a thing is, the less we can believe it just happened by blind chance. Superficially, the obvious alternative to chance is an intelligent designer.
I don't like it when videos use a source quoting another source. It's suspicious. Why not just quote the primary source? So I found this book by Bert Thompson, and in the endnotes it attributes this quote to a short article by Richard Dawkins in a 1982 issue of New Science magazine. While it's a little out of context, at least it was correctly quoted. It's fair to say that Dawkins believes that intelligent design is an alternative idea.
The source book later states, that is the very point the theist is stressing. An intelligent designer is demanded by the available evidence.
Wait, the source book later states? Which source book? The Dawkins article? No, this is a quote from Thompson's book. But David phrased this to sound like these are Dawkins' words. What did Dawkins actually write?
The more statistically improbable a thing is, the less we can believe it just happened by blind chance. Superficially, the obvious alternative to chance is an intelligent designer. But Charles Darwin showed how it is possible for blind physical forces to mimic the effects of conscious design, and, by operating as a cumulative filter of chance variations, to lead eventually to organized and adaptive complexity, to mosquitoes and mammoths, to humans and therefore, indirectly, to books and computers. Darwin's theory is now supported by all the available relevant evidence, and its truth is not doubted by any serious modern biologist.
Where did all life on Earth come from? How did it get here? The Bible declares that God created all living things during the first 6 days of the creation week. Is this true, or did life appear by itself? As with uranium-238 in its provable moment of beginning, the great pattern of all life is that it can only come from pre-existing life. This is called the law of biogenesis. Every first-year biology student knows it.
And the phrase law of biogenesis is commonly attributed to Thomas Huxley, a biologist from the late 1800s whose nickname was Darwin's Bulldog, because he was such an outspoken advocate and early promoter of evolution. Huxley was obviously well aware of both ideas. This isn't a gotcha, David. The law of biogenesis was basically a refutation of the idea of spontaneous generation. People thought that mice were created from bags of rice, or bugs from rotting fruit. This law is our day-to-day observation.
When examining tiny organisms like protozoa and bacteria, it can be demonstrated that life only comes from life. There are many kinds of life, but each continues to reproduce the same kind over and over. This is indisputable.
That depends entirely on your definition and understanding of the non-scientific word kind. In a way, this is correct. You can't escape your phylogeny, your line of descent. Some descendants of the first eukaryotes, that is, cells with a nucleus, diverged to become plants, and others to become animals, but all remained eukaryotes. Some descendants of the first vertebrates, creatures with backbones, diverged to give birth to live young, while others laid eggs, but all continued to be vertebrates. Evolution is about gradual specialization, not metamorphosis. Maybe in 1,000,000 years, there will be a population of felines that are adapted to live in water and seem very different from modern land cats. But no matter how different, they will continue to be felines.
Life can never come from non-living objects. Biologists know that all cells can only come from pre-existing cells.
Kind of, in a day-to-day sense. Ultimately, life is complex chemistry, so a long enough chain of chemistry will also get you there. See my video, Evolution is Not Origins, for more on abiogenesis.
Even the most rudimentary cells are extremely complex. The simplest organism capable of independent life, the prokaryote bacterial cell, is a masterpiece of miniaturized complexity, which makes a spaceship seem rather low-tech.
Complexity isn't a unit of measurement, nor does complexity tell you anything about whether an object was designed by intelligence or arose via natural processes. A pencil is less complex than a pile of sticks that jams a stream. But that doesn't mean the pile of sticks was designed.
Here's another source. The cell needs all its basic parts with their various functions for survival. Therefore, if the cell had evolved, it would have meant that billions of parts would have had to come into existence at the same time, in the same place, and then simultaneously come together in a precise order.
Well, this is just silly. There are prokaryotic cells with no nucleus or any specialized organelles. Current configuration doesn't negate earlier configuration.
The first law of thermodynamics points to a creator's eternal existence. Remember, this law says something cannot come from nothing.
Remember, something from nothing is a religious idea. Material models of the cosmos don't involve a philosophical nothing, but instead acknowledge matter or energy or quantum vacuum or something before the start of what we call time. To the extent that before time is a coherent concept.
Science has effectively proven that if there were not an eternal God being to create the universe, there could never have been a universe.
Science says no such thing, and David hasn't done much more than just say so.
Ignoring the evidence, evolutionists and others are forced to conjure illusions, which should be getting easier to see for what they are. But why would highly intelligent men believe such false and silly ideas and even willingly deceive people into doing the same? Get this. They do not want a God telling them what to do. They cannot have that. In their world, God must not exist.
This doesn't explain the millions of Christians around the world who accept evolution. What is their motivation, since they agree that God exists but don't deny the scientific evidence? The fact of evolution doesn't disprove God, any more than disproving evolution would prove God. These are separate questions.
The germination, growth, development, and maturation of plants into the many kinds of food available just to human beings represents its own series of miracles far too complex to recount here. It would command its own book just to explore beyond the most superficial overview. Now think hard. Who is more intelligent? God, who made perfect food, or men who find every possible way to alter and degrade it before consuming it?
You say that while on screen you show bananas, apples, and broccoli, foods that, in that form, never existed in the wild, and are instead the result of human-guided artificial selection. God didn't make perfect bananas for men to then corrupt. Humans made bananas out of God's bitter seed plants.
Yet man's creative genius has a limit. No man or group of men can create anything as marvelous as the human mind.
Yet,
everything man creates is inferior to his own mind. Try thinking of one thing that has ever been created by men that is superior to the minds who created it. You will fail.
It depends greatly on what you mean by superior. Humans have developed cameras that are superior to human eyes in level of detail and range and light spectrum. Humans have developed sound capture devices that are better than human ears. Humans have developed machines that are better capable of raw computation and memory storage than the human brain. No humans can find the patterns in massive swaths of data better than the brand new machine learning techniques. So, superior on what metric? And what would that actually prove?
Do bones and artifacts from millions of years ago tell a story, offer convincing proof that man evolved from simple organisms? What says the scientific record? Remember, we want facts, proof, not theories requiring faith to believe them. In the 1920s, a single tooth was found in western Nebraska at Snake Creek Quarry.
Here's where David will expound on a 100-year-old scientific error where a pig's tooth was temporarily mistaken to be a humanoid tooth. It was science, not religion, that caught the mistake and retracted the claims. That's what science does. It takes in new data and changes position when new data contradicts it. Nothing about evolution now, let alone 100 years ago, depended on the accuracy of the Nebraska man find.
Merely because someone found a piece of bone, sophisticated artist renderings are presented, given names, and offered as convincing visual proof that evolution occurred. Poppycock.
That's a fun word.
And Neanderthal man was later determined to be severely bow-legged because he had rickets. He was not proof from the fossil record of a half-ape, half-man transitional creature.
I'm sorry, David, but our knowledge of the Neanderthal species doesn't come from a single specimen. We have the remains of hundreds of Neanderthals. Scientists have sequenced Neanderthal DNA. and can identify the genetic differences between they and modern humans. The Rickett specimen David is referring to was found in 1908 in France, nearly 100 years after the first Neanderthal finds in the 1820s. And the mistake wasn't in identifying these bones as a non-human species. It was the mistake of French paleontologist Marcel and Boule to assume that the bow-legged nature of this skeleton would apply to the entire species. Turns out it doesn't. No big deal.
Let's summarize. No transitional forms exist anywhere in the fossil record. While evolutionists will suggest it took 50 million years for a fish to evolve into an amphibian, the simple truth is there are no transitional fossils to prove it. There are no creatures found that evidence partial fins, partial feet, or partially evolved brains, legs, eyes, organs, or other body parts.
David is misunderstanding things here. First, in their own way, all fossils represent a transition because evolution is always happening. My bones would represent a transition from my parents to my children. But of course, changes are extremely gradual, and many changes have nothing to do with the bones, so the fossils can only show us so much. Next, the phrase partially evolved doesn't actually make sense. In order to take hold in a population, a mutation must have some kind of survival advantage in that generation. Every creature is fully formed for fitness when it lived. For example, in the fish to amphibian tetrapod evolution that David asks about, in these dozen or so fossils, one can observe the stiffening of the fins, then increased fin range of movement, then joints in fins, then toes on fins for land dragging, then shoulder strengthening to allow walking. Each step is its own survival advantage. And notice how many fossils there are. Yet David says there are none. And how can David not have acknowledged one of the most famous transitional fossils of all? Tiktaalik. Famous not only for having precursors to the very features David listed, dragging itself out of the water, Tiktaalik is amazing because it was not randomly stumbled upon. It was predicted. Scientists estimated approximately when such a transition would have happened and in what part of the world. They went to that rock layer, and there it was.
Dr. Richard Leakey, considered the most famous fossil anthropologist in the world, said the skull of his famous discovery, Lucy, is so incomplete that it is mostly imagination made of plaster of Paris. He admitted no firm conclusions could be made about what species she was, even though she was assigned the age of 3.5 to 4 million years old. I have personally seen a photograph of her supposed skeleton, and it's meaningless.
First of all, David isn't a paleontologist, so his opinion on the skeleton is relatively meaningless. For those unfamiliar, Lucy is a famous specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, a creature with many features that are a fascinating blend of human and chimp. Yes, Lucy's skull wasn't complete, but she is famous because such a high percentage of her bone types were found, when you consider left side, right side mirroring at play. And again, over 300 Australopithecus afarensis individuals have been found. So nothing hinges on the completeness of any one specimen.
Grasp this. There are no links from plants to animals, reptiles to birds and mammals, etc. The fossil record shows that animals appear suddenly. When this was recognized, the whole theory of microevolution collapsed, and evolutionists admitted as much.
It's my understanding that biologists don't commonly delineate between microevolution and macroevolution, since it's an entirely arbitrary distinction about the same activity under a different scope. We don't talk about micro-walking and macro-walking. It's also one of those words easily hijacked in debate. But I don't even recognize how David is using it here. If microevolution is evolution within a species or over a short period of time, then this makes no sense. And of course, David is misrepresenting what science refer to as suddenly. There is a period in the fossil record where several body types are first located, but that period is a range of 10 to 20 million years. In geological terms, that's quick, but tens of millions of years isn't what David wants his audience to think.
They then decided that possibly the fossil record could best be described as indicating macroevolution, sometimes referred to as punctuated equilibrium or the hopeful monster theory.
Macroevolution, again not a particularly useful word, is not synonymous with punctuated equilibrium. Macroevolution is just evolution over a long period of time and greater diversifications. Punctuated equilibrium is a hypothesis that perhaps the rate of genetic change hasn't been constant over that long time, or at least in some circumstances it has been non-constant. It's a controversial idea and is potentially more an observation about rapid environmental changes. Hopeful monster theory is again something different entirely. The idea that perhaps the history of life includes individuals with profound mutant phenotypes. As this 2006 paper indicates, this idea is not currently falsifiable with empirical tests, and so has limited contribution to biology.
This ludicrous idea suggests a reptile could suddenly lay an egg that would hatch a bird. Of course, since this would be a miracle, it would require God to perform it. But evolutionists can't have that.
As we mentioned already, millions of God-believing Christians and God-believers of other faiths are convinced by the significant evidence for evolution. So many Christian pioneers in biology are happy to allow for miracles. So why do they still accept evolution? Not to avoid God, because they are not related questions.
If I sound like I'm mocking them, it's because I am. Any who mock God's existence surely believe we should at least have license to mock them.
I trust you will find that I'm not mocking David, because the ideas he puts forth are the same ideas I believed just a few years ago, before I looked into the actual science myself. I was shocked to find that many of my anti-evolution ideas were because of my misunderstanding, not because evolution has problems. If you reject evolution, it's my hope that you will at least find out what it actually claims before you reject it.
After all is said and done, the fossil record has never revealed what evolutionists hoped for. It gives distinct evidence of one fact: sudden special creation of all life in a fully formed condition. To believe anything else is to be dishonest with the evidence.
You mean like how you misrepresented nearly every scientific claim you made? It's a good thing that God's existence doesn't depend on your scientific understanding or intellectual honesty, David, because he would be in serious trouble.
Part 3 reveals many more proofs of God's existence. Don't miss it.
Okay, well, if my part 3 is available, it'll be on screen now. Or until next time, tap on this other informative video about science or theology.
Until next time, this is David C. Pack saying goodbye, friends.
Later.